Okay, we'll keep going here with the discussion of the cry of dereliction and how it relates to Christology. And I didn't have a slide for Justin Martyr, so I did want to put this up because as I make reference to him going forward. So those are his dates, and he was martyred, beheaded after a debate with a Roman philosopher. He was turned in as a heretic, not a Christian heretic, but a Roman heretic, and beheaded. Uh, and somewhere in that time was when he was doing the bulk of the writing that we have here, First and Second Apology and the Dialogue of Trypho. One thing I do want to point out is that he was canonized and made a saint. So you will hear him being referred to as Saint Justin Martyr. The fact that he was martyred had a lot to do with that too, but his contribution to the early theology of the Orthodox Church plays a role into that. So we'll go back now to Tertullian, and you'll notice it doesn't say Tertullian was a saint. He wasn't martyred. If he'd been martyred, maybe he would have had a better chance at that. I'll talk about that fact that he's not a saint a little later, but those are his dates. He is very influential in the theology that we eventually established in the Orthodox Church. And he was the first to coin the Latin term Trinity, Trinitas, and describe it as what we eventually come to know as the doctrine of the Trinity. And we got into this is the idea in his writing that we're looking at here with the cry of dereliction, and that's the impassibility of God. God's not a human being. He's incapable of suffering. Literally, that's the main meaning here, is God can't suffer. But the implications that go along with this doctrine is God's immutability, the fact that he doesn't change, the fact that he doesn't suffer pain or emotion, and he's not vulnerable in any way to external forces. He can't be influenced by anything outside of himself. And this became an important doctrine in the early Christian debate about the relationship between Jesus and the Father. One thing I didn't mention that I wanted to mention here, I think I didn't mention it because it just it's obvious to me and it kind of jumps out at me. The impassibility of God, the idea of it comes from one aspect of God that is very important to us. And once you make this connection, I think this notion of him not being changeable and not suffering influence from the outside all relates back to one idea, and that's the omnipotence of God. Without that, he's not omnipotent. He's not all powerful. If he can be changed in some way, or if he can be influenced in some way, he's not all powerful. So his impassibility comes from the idea that he is omnipotent. And so if you want him to be omnipotent, you have to also figure out why he's not emotional. Or why he's not influenced by outside forces in any way. And that's kind of where we leave this idea and start looking at the practical things that Tertullian talks about here. So he talks about the relationship and how Jesus is both divine and human, two substances that are alleged to be in Christ, divine and human. Plainly follows that divine is immortal and the human is mortal, and that which died was the nature which was anointed. So it was his human substance that died, and it was the human substance that was anointed. I didn't point this out last week, and I should have. The Messiah was the human part of Jesus. because God couldn't be the Messiah himself. So the God part wasn't the Messiah, it was the human part that was the Messiah. So that's a distinction that he's making here, is that that which died was the nature that was anointed, Christ, Messiah. And he follows on that idea with the suffering. How could the Son suffer if the Father did not suffer with him? The Father is separate from the Son, though not from him as God. So there's a separation between the Father and the Son in the mortal, but not in the immortal. So Jesus is both divine, God, and man. That's his principal description of the situation as he approaches this. And then you remember the example that he gives about the spring and the river. The river gets dirty, but the dirt never gets back to the source, never gets back to the spring. God the Father's the spring. So Jesus has both elements. But the suffering of Jesus could not wash back to God. So again, continuing to hold the idea of God's impassibility. And so then we move directly to the quote. You have him exclaiming in the midst of his passion, my God, why have you forsaken me? Either then the Son suffered, being forsaken by the Father, and the Father consequently suffered nothing, inasmuch as he forsook the Son. So there again, and this is what he believes, this is his idea, that there is a distinction, there's a difference between Son as man and Son as God. And so the Son as God part did not suffer, inasmuch as he forsook the Son, or else, if it was the Father who suffered, then to what God was it that he addressed his cry? But this was the voice of the flesh and soul, that is to say, of man, not of the word and spirit, that is to say, not of God, and it was uttered so as to prove the impassibility of God, who forsook his Son, so far as he handed over his human substance to the suffering of death. So there we see this distinction again, the difference between the human substance and the divine substance in Jesus. There's these two this is some sort of separation there, but they are not but they are also unified in Jesus. Again, talking about the idea that we see in our modern notion that he's 100% God and 100% man. Now, I wanted to show you this quote, which is this is at the very beginning of this Against Praxeas that we've been looking at, because this is where we see the idea that he's talking about as we approach this next section. By this Praxeas, so this is the person he's addressing his criticisms against, Praxeas did a twofold service for the devil at Rome. So when Praxeas did what he did, we'll talk about that in a little later. He actually gets something done that Tertullian does not like. By this, Praxeas did a twofold service for the devil at Rome. He drove away prophecy, and he brought in heresy. He put to flight the paraclete, which is the driving away of the prophecy that he's talking about, and he crucified the Father. So by Praxeas's notions, Jesus was also the Father. They were the same. And that's what he's criticizing here, and that's what he comes to call patripassianism. So he makes this term up, Father Sufferer, and because he accuses Praxeas, and that's what he calls Praxeas is a Father Crucifier, a Father Sufferer. So Praxeas claimed that the connection with Jesus was direct. And so by killing Jesus, they also killed God, the Father. And obviously the argument with Tertullian is God can't die, so they didn't kill God. So there had to be some distinction there. The other, and so it eventually, patripassianism gets a better name. So you will also today more often hear it called modalism. Modalism better describes what we're talking about here, because there was a large group of people that believed what we're calling here modalism back then to describe the relationship between Jesus and God the Father and the Holy Spirit. And that is that God is simply taking forms. There is no division. So when God comes as Jesus, he simply takes the form of Jesus, but he's still God. And there's no distinction there. It's God the Son, but God still. This idea of modalism then is that God doesn't exist in three different persons. God only exists as himself, but he takes different forms. So in the Old Testament, when the three men came to Abraham and one of them was God, it was God taking a human form, but it was still God. It wasn't a separate thing, a theophany that we would look on as Jesus from the New Testament point of view. Tertullian is working against Praxeas here, describing what's wrong with that idea all throughout this. God did not suffer, God cannot suffer, Jesus did suffer. And that's the other thing that he talks about here in some depth is what comes to be called Docetism, that Jesus was a man, and Jesus did go through all the things that a human would, because Docetism teaches that Jesus was not really a man, that he only appeared to be a man. And that comes, a lot of this comes from the idea that we see in, that we talked about with the Gnosticism, in that material is bad. How could God take on material? Because material is bad. So God only appeared to take on material, but not really, because if he did, he would be bad. And so Doceticism teaches that Jesus was not human, but he only appeared to be human. And again, I pointed out that that starts showing up really early, because we see it in 1st and 2nd John in the Bible, where it talks about that there are those who claim that Jesus had not come in the flesh. And so if Jesus hasn't come in the flesh, how did he come? He came in some other form. Now, the implications of what Tertullian's talking about here. From Tertullian, and this comes down to us today through the doctrine of the Trinity, something we have to kind of work out is, if we're going to believe impassibility, and we're also going to believe that Jesus was man and God, we have to figure this out. If Unless we decide we don't want to figure it out, this is the question that we have left. And this is the question that they spend the next couple centuries trying to fix. If he's both 100% human and 100% God, how does that mix? How does that relate? What does that mean? How does the God part interact with the man part, and how does the man part interact with the God part? And these questions come about because of what's in the New Testament, because of how it is written into the New Testament that there is some sort of connection and some sort of relationship, but it doesn't explain it scientifically, so we can't figure it out. So then they spend the next 2.5 centuries working out the details. Hebrews 4, for the word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and spirit. So this is describing a situation where there is a split between soul and spirit. We never really see that happen. It's kind of the idea that we have about what happens when you die, but there's no direct explanation of that. But it's talking about the Word, which is Jesus, as we just see it described as the Logos. For the Word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. So then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. Now, there's there's some differentiation here in this verse that we typically wouldn't make in our time, but in their time it would have meant something different to them. It says that he has passed through the heavens, and that's only in one direction. So the idea was Jesus went this way. There's no discussion here about Jesus coming this way. So you have to be careful how you read things into these passages that aren't really there. That's not a big deal as to what we're talking about here, but I just want to point that out. This next verse is the one that has the important pieces in it. For we do not have a high priest, Jesus, who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So what is the implication there? Jesus came as what? Man. He was a human because he went through the same things we go through. Specifically in this case, he was tempted the same way that we are tempted. And let me point this out because it doesn't get pointed out very much when we go through the New Testament. We're reading the New Testament, and there's all these places where it talks about temptation. The word temptation is a bad word to translate here because we bring baggage with the word temptation. The Greek word is really more like test because it's testing, it's not temptation. We take temptation to mean, here's sin, let's see if you can do it or not. But testing doesn't necessarily mean temptation in the sense that God is trying to get you to sin. God is testing you to expose to you what your situation is rather than trying to get you to sin. But the idea here, the main idea we're trying to get at here is that God, through Jesus, became man, and now Jesus, and so what the imagery is here, I think this is the best way to look at this. The imagery here is Jesus passed into the heavens. We know from other passages here that he's seated at the right hand of God. And so he's able to tell God, when we talk to Jesus, he's able to tell God how it feels. That's the idea. So he's sitting there beside a God, telling God about how this works. Now, that's probably overstating it, but that's the imagery. Okay? So, and that again gets to the connection question. Does Jesus have to tell God anything, or does God know everything Jesus knows because Jesus and God are the same thing? So, Mark 1. And he was in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan. So he was being tested by Satan, and he was with wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. So there are connections here, and we're going to look at something else here in just a second. But he was in the wilderness, and he was with, and there were angels there ministering to him, serving him. So what serving him means, we don't know, but you wouldn't think God would need any help, right? So there's that implication here. There's this human element, okay? Same idea from Matthew. And he said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. And Jesus said to him, to the devil, again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. So Jesus' response to Satan here was, you shouldn't test God. He wasn't talking about himself. He was saying, you shouldn't try to get me to test God by throwing myself down just to see if he'll save me. So, again, there's this separation piece. Jesus was saying, I shouldn't test God because it's written that you shouldn't test God. That was his defense against Satan. So we have this. So here we have a high priest who can sympathize with our weaknesses. And here we have him being tested. So he was tested the same way that we are, right? But then we also have James, who says, let no one say when he is tempted that I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he tempts no one. So here Jesus is tempted, but God can't be tempted. How do the God part and the man part relate? Where's the connection? How do they separate? Because they have to separate, but they also have to be together. If you look at the crucifixion between the book of Mark and Matthew 2 and the book of Luke, there are some very distinct differences. So remember, in Mark, we have the only thing, in Matthew 2, the only thing Jesus says on the cross is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then there's, at the end, Jesus utters a loud cry and dies. They don't tell us, Matthew and Mark don't tell us what that loud cry was. There's just a cry. Whether or not it was words or not, they don't say. Also in Mark, Jesus is generally passive and quiet all through there. And in Luke, it's different. So in Luke, as he's carrying the cross down the street, the women are crying. And he stops and he says, don't cry for me, cry for yourself. And then when we get to the cross, he never says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in Mark and Matthew, it says that the two that he was crucified with, the two criminals he was crucified with, both of them mock him. It says they mocked him. In Luke, it only says one of them did, and that the other one stood up for Jesus. And when that one stood up for Jesus, Jesus tells him, today you will be with me in paradise. So there's the contrast again. And this is one of the reasons I like Justin's idea of what the whole cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me, what it's about. Because if you look at those two quotes, my God, why have you forsaken me, and then him telling the thief, today you will be with me in paradise, they don't really line up. Because if he knows all along that that's what's going to happen, why does he feel so bad? So, but you kind of get this whole idea from Luke that it's not as big a deal as it's made out to be in Matthew and Mark. That Jesus is completely in control of the situation. Whereas in Mark and Matthew, he's more the man guy. He's more being tortured in Matthew and Mark than he is in Luke. In Luke, he doesn't feel tortured as much. So that's more of the God perspective. So you see this little distinction here. Those who were crucified with him also reviled against him. And then in the ninth hour, he cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Luke, one of the criminals railed at him, but the other rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God? And he said to him, truly today you will be with me in paradise. So there's a different mood, I guess is the easiest way to say it. You're getting a lot more of the physical here and a lot more of the God here. Now, this whole idea comes through in some of the other people that we know were teaching and preaching and getting converts in the 2nd century. One of them was a guy named Marcion. He ultimately, and this is where we'll pick it up, this has some impact on lots of things that happen after him. He's really one of the reasons we have the canon that we have. So he was born in roughly 85, died roughly 60, and he was basically a ditheist. Kind of gets back to the idea that we saw in the Apocryphon of John, but he literally taught that there were two gods. There was God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, and then there was the real God, and Yahweh's the bad guy, and the one monad, the one God, same idea from the Gnostic Apocryphon of John people, the Sethians. He's the good guy. And Jesus comes to fix all the stuff that Yahweh broke. That's Marcion's teaching. Marcion had a very large following. very large. Um, he was the first one to make a canon of the New Testament that we're aware of. He had a list of books that you should read, and a list, and so if it's not on that list, you shouldn't read it. That list included 10 of Paul's letters, including the letter to the Laodiceans, which we didn't end up with in our canon. He was very much a follower of Paul. And any distinctions that he saw in Paul that didn't quite line up with anything else was wrong. Paul was right, anything else was wrong. There were some problems in Paul, even for him, but he tended to have a way to get around those. And he also had a gospel. There was a gospel of Marcion, which apparently was really the gospel of Luke. So he went along with the gospel of Luke and Paul's epistles, but the interesting thing about the gospel of Luke was that there were things in the gospel of Luke he didn't like. So he edited it. So Marcion's version didn't include the birth narrative, none of that stuff at the beginning. And then he took out a few things that didn't quite follow along with what he believed. But ultimately, his goal was to prove that the Old Testament God was not the good guy, that Jesus came from the true God to get everybody back on the right path. Probably will shock you that he was eventually excommunicated. But like I said, he had a big, big following. And so there's Marcionism well into the history of the church. But it didn't take root, and so it was eventually. But you're going to see, if you read through the church fathers, you'll find all sorts of writings against him. Tertullian wrote a whole book against Marcion. Okay, and we get some explanation in that book that is a little further along in what we're discussing here. So we're going to pick it up there next week, where he talks about the Marcionites and what they believe and how that relates to what we're talking about. So we'll go from there next week.